Oh, it's you again. I'm glad you find peace at my fire. If you're listening to this very moment, then that means you truly are one of the faithful, a true guardian of the light, and I deeply appreciate your company. With that being said, let us begin tonight's story. Tonight we drift back before the stars, before the first breath of time, to a quiet garden where two nameless things played a game that would shape everything. One planted, one reaped. From their disagreement, all of creation would spill out into being. This is the tale of the winnower and the gardener. Are you all set? Good. A gardener and a winnower once shared a single garden, and they shared it long before the first star ever burned, long before time itself had begun to move. The words before and after mean very little here, because there was no clock to measure them, no dawn to count, no falling of one moment into the next. There was only the garden, and there were only the two who tended it. If you tried to trace their history backward, hoping to find the moment they were born or the place they came from, you would find nothing waiting at the end of that road. There was no cradle for them, no parent, no first breath. They simply existed, the way that certain truths exist, quiet and permanent and impossible to argue away. To call them a gardener and a winnower gives them faces and hands they never truly had. They were principles more than they were people, forces woven into the deepest logic of what could ever be. One of them planted, one of them reaped. That difference between them, small as it sounds when spoken aloud, would eventually grow large enough to spill out into everything that would ever be made. Yet in the beginning, there was only their quiet work, carried out in a place that did not sit inside any world, because no world had been built yet to hold it. The garden was a strange thing to imagine, and it helps to picture it as a wide field of every possibility that could ever unfold. Think of it as a vast space where every shape a universe might take was still only a seed, still only a chance, still waiting to be tried. Nothing in it had been decided. Everything in it was allowed. Rows upon rows of potential stretched outward in all directions, each one a version of what might someday grow into stars and worlds and living things. The gardener and the winnower walked among these rows, and their walking was itself a kind of thought, a way of moving through all the outcomes that had not yet been chosen. The gardener loved the mornings best. In the morning, the gardener would kneel down and press seeds into the wet, dark loam, curious to see what each one might become. Every seed was a question, and the gardener asked those questions gladly, delighting in the surprise of not knowing the answer. Some seeds would rise into wonders. Some would twist into shapes no one could have guessed. The gardener wanted to see them all, wanted to watch each strange and lovely thing climb up toward a light that had not yet been invented. There was joy in the planting, and there was patience in the waiting. The winnower belonged to the evenings. When the long day was done, the winnower moved through the same rows the gardener had planted, and it looked at everything that had grown. Then it began the work of separating. What had flourished was allowed to remain. What had failed was gathered up and set aside, cut cleanly from the rest. The winnower did this without cruelty and without hesitation, the way a blade does its work without needing to be angry. To the winnower, this sorting was the most honest thing in all the garden. Growth was only half of any story. The other half was the ending, the closing, the quiet decision of what would carry on and what would not. Their days and nights did not run at any speed a living creature could recognize. The day between morning and evening stretched longer than the whole of time that would come after it, wide enough to hold uncountable seasons of planting and growing, and the night that followed could pass faster than a single glint of light. sliding across a falling crystal of sugar, gone almost before it arrived. Time bent around them because they stood outside of it, and the rhythm of their work set a pattern all its own, a heartbeat older than any heart. So they carried on, the two of them, planting and reaping, each following the nature that had always been theirs. Neither one questioned the other, at least not yet. Neither one imagined that this quiet arrangement might ever break. And in that endless, patient garden, where every seed was a chance and every evening was a judgment, the two who would one day divide all of creation still worked side by side. To understand how such a pair could exist at all, without beginning and without maker, we must look closer at what they truly were. A traveler, walking backward down the physical path of history, eventually steps directly into the damp loam of this garden. Tracing the oldest fossilized bloodlines and the deepest roots of existence leads to this exact patch of dirt, where these two figures work the soil. They existed as the absolute foundation of everything. Their presence was a required fact of the universe, locked in place like the heavy stones of a foundation. The cosmos demanded a creator to plant the seeds and a destroyer to harvest the stalks, and so these two walked the furrows. Their bodies shifted in the haze of the garden, towering over the furrows and casting long shadows across the tilled earth. The gardener radiated a brilliant, blinding aura, leaving glowing footprints burned deep into the mud. The winnower absorbed the ambient glow, wearing a cloak of absolute blackness that dragged along the dirt, freezing the dew on the grass. Together, they represented the fundamental mechanics of reality, bound to the soil and bound to their tools. The gardener gripped a woven satchel overflowing with pulsing, glowing seeds, while the winnower rested a pale, heavy hand on the iron hilt of a long scythe. The gardener carried the raw power of the light. The air around the gardener shimmered with intense heat and blinding white luminescence. When the gardener reached out, sparks of bright energy cascaded down into the soil. The dirt warmed, baking and cracking from the rapid expansion of life. Green shoots burst upward through the crust of the earth, twisting and dividing into thick vines and wide leaves. The light forced everything to grow, to multiply, to reach higher into the air. It brought a heavy, humid warmth to the garden, packing the atmosphere with the smell of wet pollen, crushed sap, and ozone. The gardener's hands dripped with the bright green juices of 1,000,000 growing things. The winnower moved with the heavy certainty of the darkness. Shadows lengthened and swallowed the bright spaces. The air grew brittle, freezing the moisture on the broad leaves into sharp crystals of ice. The winnower carried a blade, and the metal gleamed with a black, oily sheen. The darkness acted as a final boundary, enforcing absolute limits on the rampant overgrowth. It brought a chilling wind that snapped the heavy branches, shattered the fragile leaves, and hardened the soft soil into solid stone. The winnower's domain was the sharp edge, the clean cut, the reduction of sprawling vines into single, manageable stalks. The wake of the winnower smelled of frost, shattered rock, and deep, cold earth. These forces pushed against each other across the rows. The gardener sparked an explosion of tangled briars, filling a ditch with bright petals and thick roots. The winnower stepped into that same ditch, swinging the black blade to sever the mess, leaving only the strongest stem standing in the frost. The interplay of the humid light and the freezing darkness churned the soil constantly. They walked side by side, leaving a trail of furious growth and immediate harvest. The garden operated on their strict movements. The gardener forced immense complexity upon the land. Every seed planted fractured into dozens of competing species. Leaves sprouted smaller leaves along their veins. Roots splintered into microscopic webs, gripping the rocks and pulling minerals upward. The energy of the light fueled this endless multiplication. The space around the gardener buzzed with the sounds of snapping wood, stretching fibers, and rushing sap. It was a crowded domain, bursting with the heavy weight of countless forms fighting for space. The winnower answered this heavy overgrowth with absolute simplicity. The heavy boots of the winnower crushed the sprawling weeds flat into the mud. The dark blade swung in wide, whistling arcs, slicing through the thickest trunks with a single metallic chime that echoed across the fields. The darkness stripped away the extra leaves, the weak shoots, and the suffocating vines. It left behind smooth, unblemished wood. The air around the winnower fell completely silent, holding only the crisp, sharp scent of severed stems and frozen sap. The winnower shaped the loud chaos into stark, isolated pillars of life. They formed a closed cycle. The soil required the gardener to fill it with roots, and it required the winnower to clear the surface. The history of the garden was written entirely in these overlapping footprints. The glowing, scorched earth left by the gardener's radiant hands, and the frozen, cleanly swept furrows left by the winnower's blade. They acted as the twin pillars holding up the sky of this strange place. Every stalk of wheat, every blooming flower, and every rotting log bore the mark of both the blinding light and the freezing dark. Their lineage began and ended with themselves, standing as pure, singular forms. To govern this endless work, the two forces divided their time in the garden into strict shifts. The sky above them shifted to match their labors, alternating between a bright, glaring haze and a deep, starless black. The gardener took the first shift, flooding the fields with heat and activity, while the winnower waited for the temperature to drop and the shadows to stretch across the dirt. When the firmament above the furrows burned a brilliant, solid white, the gardener stepped into the saturated loam. The heavy soil clung to the gardener's glowing feet, rich with trapped moisture and packed with jagged, broken minerals. The gardener carried a woven sack resting against a hip, and the inside of the sack overflowed with glowing, pulsating seeds. Reaching into the coarse fabric, the gardener pulled out thick handfuls of these seeds and pushed them deep into the wet dirt. Sparks of bright, blinding energy cascaded from the gardener's fingers, sinking directly into the mud and rapidly heating the ground. Steam rose from the overturned furrows, carrying the heavy scent of ozone, damp earth, and crushed sap. Green shoots immediately pierced the crust of the earth. The stems thickened into pale trunks, branching outward into wide, waxy leaves that dripped with condensation. The gardener walked steadily down the long rows, pressing more seeds into the ground, watching the flora mutate and multiply while the dirt was still shifting. The vegetation climbed over itself, creating dense, overlapping canopies of emerald vines, barbed thorns, and broad blue petals. The roots dug downward, fracturing the subterranean rock and pulling vast quantities of water to the surface. This rapid, overwhelming expansion of life manifested the raw power of the light, a physical force driving continuous, constant growth across every available surface. The morning extended into a day that spanned a staggering, vast duration. The white firmament remained fixed overhead, while millions of generations of vines choked the furrows. The trunks expanded outward, crushing against one another, until the bark fused into massive, solid walls of dense wood. The garden swelled with the loud, persistent sounds of snapping timber, stretching cellulose fibers and rushing fluids pumping through millions of stems. The upper canopy grew so thick that it completely absorbed the white glare, casting the lower levels into a humid, dark swamp of rotting leaves, fermenting sap, and crushed seedlings. The gardener waded through this dense undergrowth, packing fresh seeds into the remaining patches of mud, constantly feeding the immense, sprawling tangle. The intense heat of the light baked the uppermost leaves into a crisp golden layer, while the lower roots drowned in the trapped, stagnant moisture. The sheer volume of biological mass covered every inch of the landscape, stacking higher and higher into the glowing sky. The white glare finally receded, replaced instantly by a deep, pure black firmament. The ambient temperature plummeted, instantly freezing the humid steam into sharp, heavy ice crystals that coated the massive canopies. The winnower entered the garden, carrying a long scythe forged from a dark, light-absorbing metal. The winnower stepped up to the edge of the overgrown, frozen furrows and raised the heavy blade. The metal sliced through the frozen trunks with a sharp, resonant chime. The winnower walked down the rows, deliberately cutting away the rotting wood, the dying vines, and the fragile, crushed shoots. The blade separated the strongest, most towering stalks from the tangled, competing mess beneath them. The winnower gathered the fallen debris, kicking the shattered ice and severed leaves out of the furrows and into flat piles. The darkness operated through this exact mechanical reduction, physically stripping away the excess to leave only the most resilient stems standing upright in the freezing air. This period of reaping executed with intense, immediate speed. The entire harvest concluded faster than a glint of light reflecting off a falling sugar crystal. The winnower swung the blade in rapid, precise arcs, clearing miles of overgrown vegetation in single, sweeping motions. The freezing air preserved the severed stalks, instantly turning the running sap into solid, crystallized amber. The loud, crushing noise of the day's overgrowth gave way to the crisp, rhythmic snapping of frozen wood and the quiet, metallic sliding of the dark scythe. The winnower evaluated the remaining flora, leaving only the thickest, most isolated pillars of wood firmly anchored in the dirt. The ground, previously covered in a deep swamp of rotting vegetation, transformed into a flat, hardened surface of frozen mud and neatly separated roots. The winnower completed the harvest, establishing clean, distinct rows ready for the next planting. The two entities repeated this physical cycle, matching the brilliant, continuous days of planting with the dark, rapid nights of harvest. The gardener populated the space with a chaotic, suffocating abundance of biological forms. The winnower cleared the space, reducing the chaotic abundance down to a sparse, orderly arrangement of the strongest specimens. They maintained the exact physical dimensions of the fields through this continuous addition and subtraction. Within the freshly cleared soil, unique forms of life began to emerge from the leftover seeds, adapting to the extreme shifts between the humid light and the freezing dark. Insects with segmented shells buzzed between the isolated, towering flowers, their wings vibrating in the cold air. Pale, smooth-headed worms slithered between the frozen roots, consuming the crystallized sap and churning the hardened mud. Rain composed of heavy, metallic drops fell from the black canopy, pooling around the base of a singular, massive structure, taking root in the center of the furrows. Heavy drops of moisture condensed directly out of the thick, dark atmosphere, falling in a steady rhythm upon the flat mud of the furrows. The liquid pooled in the deep indentations left by the heavy boots of the winnower, gathering into wide, reflective puddles. Each drop struck the surface of the water with a sharp, metallic ring, sending concentric ripples outward to lap against the severed roots. The moisture soaked into the hardened earth, softening the frost and returning the soil to a thick, dark loam. Across the broad, wax-coated leaves of the surviving flora, insects with thick, segmented chitin crawled slowly. Their shells gleamed under the shifting light, colored in deep shades of iridescent green and bruised purple. They gripped the veins of the plants with hooked appendages, dragging their heavy bodies upward toward the canopy. As they moved, their translucent wings vibrated rapidly, producing a low, continuous hum that filled the spaces between the towering stalks. The sound of millions of vibrating wings layered over the metallic chiming of the rain, creating a dense wall of ambient noise. Beneath the surface of the wet earth, pale worms slithered through the newly softened mud, their long, smooth bodies stretched and compressed with deliberate, muscular contractions, pushing them forward through the compressed soil. They chewed through the crystallized sap and swallowed the jagged, broken minerals lying dormant in the dirt. Their skin secreted a thick mucus, allowing them to slide safely past the sharp edges of shattered stones. They digested the hardened debris and left trails of aerated, nutrient-rich dirt in their wake. Their continuous movement churned the ground, breaking down the remnants of the previous harvest and preparing the furrows for the next cycle of seeds. The worms pushed deeper, winding their way around the thick, immovable taproots that anchored the largest plants to the bedrock below. Deep, resonant vibrations rolled through the humid air, carrying the distinct cadence and inflection of spoken words. The sounds originated entirely from the physical movements of the garden itself. The friction of heavy bark, rubbing against neighboring trunks, produced low, guttural syllables. The snapping of thawing ice crystals generated sharp, clicking consonants. The slow, immense grinding of the tectonic plates beneath the dirt created long, sustained vowels. Together, these environmental noises formed a continuous, overlapping chorus that echoed across the open fields. The vibrations held enough physical force to agitate the water in the puddles, causing the silver liquid to tremble and spit tiny droplets back into the air. In the exact center of this shifting landscape, towering over the surrounding vegetation, stood a massive, singular structure, its roots anchored deeply into the crushed bedrock, thick and smooth, wrapped in a pale bark that pulsed with a slow, steady rhythm. The trunk rose high above the canopy of the garden, expanding outward into a wide, sprawling crown. The branches stretched horizontally across the sky, supporting thousands of long, metallic feathers. The feathers caught the ambient glow of the garden, gleaming with a bright, sterling finish. Each feather featured a rigid central shaft supporting hundreds of interlocking metallic barbs. They overlapped perfectly, creating a dense, silver canopy that shielded the ground below from the heavy rain. As the deep vibrations of the garden rolled through the air, the branches swayed, grinding the quills against the heavy wood. This friction released clouds of fine, luminous silver dust that drifted slowly downward, coating the mud and the crawling insects in a thin layer of glittering powder. The tree maintained a continuous, rapid cycle of growth. From the thick joints of its branches, heavy, spherical fruits pushed through the bark. The fruits swelled as they absorbed the rushing sap, stretching their metallic skins until the surface tension broke. The skins split open with sharp cracks, dropping dense, heavy seeds into the puddles below. The moment the seeds fell, the long silver feathers detached from their branches. They spun down through the damp air, landing softly on the wet earth. The crown of the tree stood completely bare for a fraction of a second before new buds pushed through the rough wood, unfurling immediately into fresh, gleaming feathers. The tree bloomed, yielded its heavy fruit, shed its metallic plumage, and bloomed again, anchoring the center of the furrows in a constant state of physical renewal. While the garden buzzed with the hum of insects and the deep vibrations of the grinding rock, the gardener and the winnower prepared for a different kind of activity. Between the saturated heat of the morning and the freezing chill of the evening, the two forces met upon a perfectly flat expanse of packed dirt to engage in a structured, deliberate exercise. They carved a massive two-dimensional grid into the mud, pulling straight, intersecting lines that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. At specific intersections of this vast board, they placed individual, freshly harvested blooms, setting up the precise starting conditions for an intricate simulation. The gardener and the winnower sat across from each other, separated by the massive grid they had carved into the hardened mud. The lines intersected at exact right angles, forming countless identical squares that extended outward until they blurred into the distant horizon. During the long pause between the morning planting and the evening harvest, they occupied themselves with this structure. They did not build houses or forge weapons. They played a game. The garden acted as a vast physical simulator, and this grid was the machine they used to test the shapes of possibility. They called it the flower game. To play, they gathered the thick, heavy blooms left over from the winnower's harvest. The petals of these flowers felt like thick velvet, colored in deep shades of violet and crimson, with dense clusters of yellow pollen at their centers. The gardener reached into a pile of these severed blooms and placed them onto specific intersections of the grid. The winnower watched the placement carefully, occasionally reaching out a pale hand to shift a flower to a different coordinate. They arranged the initial layout together, establishing a specific starting pattern of living blooms against the empty squares of dirt. Once the initial flowers were placed in the mud, the game ran itself according to strict, unbending mechanics. The gardener and the winnower stepped back from the grid, withdrawing their hands. The rules of the game took over, dictating the fate of every flower on the board simultaneously. The board pulsed with a low, thrumming energy, vibrating the dirt beneath the petals. The flowers responded instantly to the presence or absence of their immediate neighbors, shifting states in a continuous, cascading sequence. If a living flower found itself with fewer than 2 living neighbors on the adjacent squares, the thick petals immediately shriveled. The bright colors drained away, leaving a dry, brittle husk that crumbled into gray dust. The garden's mechanics identified these isolated blooms as cut off, lacking the necessary support to sustain their physical form. The dust blew away across the flat dirt, leaving the intersection completely empty. The winnower watched these isolated failures turn to ash, nodding at the clean, efficient removal of the weak. This simulation ran at an impossible speed. The grid flashed with activity, entire sections of the board shifting from vibrant color to gray dust in the span of a single heartbeat. The gardener and the winnower did not need to physically touch the board again. They simply observed the cascading reactions. The patterns expanded, collapsed, and shifted across the endless dirt, driven entirely by the initial arrangement of the blooms. They watched these rapid iterations to see what shapes would emerge from the simple starting conditions. The flower game served as a physical mechanism for generating universes. Every pattern that expanded across the grid represented a different potential reality, a different combination of physical laws and biological structures. By placing the flowers in different configurations, the two entities simulated countless variations of existence, testing how different starting conditions would unfold over deep time. They ran the game over and over, wiping the board clean and setting up new patterns, searching the grid for shapes that could sustain themselves against the strict mechanics of the simulation. To anyone else, this endless arrangement of flowers on a dirt grid might look like a simple, repetitive task. Yet the gardener and the winnower devoted their entire existence between shifts to this exact process. The mechanics of the grid held the pure, unfiltered logic of cause and effect. The game fascinated kings and occupied the minds of emperors because it contained the absolute truth of how complex structures build themselves from basic components. There was no deception on the board, no hidden variables, and no divine intervention once the initial pieces were set. The flowers lived or died based entirely on their position. They continued to arrange the blooms, filling the grid with massive, sprawling designs. Some patterns immediately collapsed, burning out in a flash of grey dust. Other patterns locked into stable, repeating loops, oscillating between 2 or 3 shapes without ever expanding or degrading. The most complex patterns moved across the board, like crawling insects, shifting their structure as they traveled over the empty dirt. The gardener leaned forward, eyes fixed on these traveling shapes, tracking their progress across the vast expanse of the grid. The winnower sat perfectly still, observing the same shapes with a cool, detached focus, waiting to see how long they could survive the unyielding rules of the garden. The gardener and the winnower established the starting arrangement by placing heavy blooms directly onto the flat intersections of the grid. The gardener pushed a thick stem into the wet dirt at a specific coordinate, and the winnower placed a second bloom on an adjacent square. They positioned lines of flowers, dense rectangular clusters, and sprawling asymmetrical formations across the center of the vast board. Once they set the final bloom of their chosen configuration, they pulled their hands back and stood at the edge of the carved mud. The physical progression of the board relied entirely on the exact geometry of that initial arrangement. The entities restricted their physical involvement solely to this first step, leaving the subsequent reactions entirely to the strict parameters of the grid. The dirt on the board vibrated as the physical rules engaged, causing the flowers to react simultaneously to the proximity of their neighbors. Whenever a blooming flower stood on an intersection surrounded by exactly 2 or exactly 3 adjacent plants, it remained firmly anchored in the soil. The roots maintained their tight grip on the hardened mud, and the thick petals retained their deep violet and crimson colors. The neighboring stems provided a precise equilibrium, sharing the available moisture and sheltering the central flower from the heavy winds of the garden. The plant held its physical shape perfectly, thriving in the balanced environment created by its immediate surroundings. When the initial arrangement forced a single flower to be surrounded by 4 or more neighbors, the physical conditions immediately turned hostile. The thick roots of the surrounding plants drove deep into the same narrow patch of soil, rapidly draining the water and hoarding the jagged minerals. The broad, waxy leaves pressed heavily inward from all sides, crushing the central flower and completely blocking the ambient light. Starved of essential resources and physically smothered by the heavy biomass, the central bloom withered in a fraction of a second. The brightly colored petals dried into brittle husks, the stem snapped under the immense pressure, and the entire plant collapsed into a pile of gray ash. The ash scattered across the flat dirt, leaving the intersection completely bare. The physical interactions extended outward into the unoccupied squares of the grid. Whenever exactly 3 living flowers bordered a blank intersection, Their combined physical presence triggered an immediate reaction in the dormant soil. The roots of the three adjacent plants pushed excess moisture and nutrients into the center square, saturating the dirt. The overhanging petals shed thick yellow pollen directly onto the wet mud. A thick green shoot violently pierced the crust of the earth at that exact coordinate, expanding instantly into a fully mature bloom. A new flower materialized in the exposed mud, filling the space entirely, as a result of the specific conditions created by the three adjacent plants. The shapes moving across the board took on distinct physical forms, based entirely on these overlapping mechanics. A cluster of 5 flowers arranged in an asymmetrical step produced a crawling mechanism. As the rules applied, the front edge of the cluster sprouted new petals, and the back edge crumbled into ash. This repeating cycle caused the entire 5-flower structure to march diagonally across the infinite grid, leaving a trail of disturbed dirt behind it. The winnower watched the traveling shape slide across the intersections, tracing its path with a pale finger. Another arrangement of 3 flowers in a straight horizontal line flipped into a vertical line on the next iteration, and then back again, oscillating back and forth like a spinning rotor. The grid pulsed with these moving, changing structures. The exact mechanical structure of this grid would eventually manifest in the physical universe, reaching the cold stone keeps and towering libraries of mortal civilizations. Human rulers draped in heavy animal furs would sit at long wooden tables, carving identical intersecting lines into the dark timber. They pushed small polished stones and carved bones across the squares by the flickering light of tallow candles, tracking the exact same geometric reactions observed in the garden. Scribes sitting in damp, drafty towers scratched coordinates onto coarse parchment until their inkpots ran dry, tracing the paths of the shifting shapes. Their fingers grew calloused from gripping the heavy iron quills, and their eyes strained against the dim firelight, mesmerized by the unfolding patterns. The physical mechanics of the grid held their complete attention, forcing them to watch how simple starting positions generated sprawling, intricate designs across the flat surfaces of their tables and scrolls. Back in the deep loam of the primordial garden, the gardener and the winnower continued to run the simulation. The gardener used the edge of the woven satchel to sweep the grey ash off the board, clearing the intersections to reveal the clean dirt underneath. Together, they set down new starting configurations, testing entirely different geometries. As they placed the heavy petals in wide arcs and tight squares, the subsequent reactions produced massive, complex structures that crawled, expanded, and rotated across the vast mud fields. The stems of the flowers thickened and twisted together across the flat dirt of the grid, locking their barbed thorns into dense, rigid structures. They formed vertical pillars of compressed cellulose, stacking higher into the humid air. Wide canopies of overlapping leaves stretched between these pillars, creating suspended bridges and domed roofs over the wet mud. The expanding flora built sprawling, intricate settlements out of their own biological mass. The roots fused into smooth, paved roads running along the intersections, while the heavy blossoms formed sealed chambers filled with thick, trapped pollen. Below these dense canopies, clusters of small, mobile blooms detached from the central root systems. They dragged themselves over the paved roots using short, segmented vines, moving together in synchronized lines. The vines propelled the small blossoms through the archways and over the suspended leaf bridges, creating streams of continuous traffic throughout the structural layout. Bright pulses of bioluminescence traveled along the thick veins of the large leaves above them, casting shifting patterns of light over the moving clusters. The light flashed in rapid, complex sequences, jumping from one flower to the next through the physical connection of their creeping vines. The flashing energy circulated through the entire biological settlement, mimicking the fast, continuous firing of electrical signals traveling through a massive nervous system. The heavy scent of roasted nectar and burning ozone wafted up from the busiest intersections, marking the areas of highest activity. When the moving clusters collided or overpopulated a single square on the grid, the physical strain manifested immediately. Heavy, dominant vines wrapped around the fragile stems, constricting the flow of water and sap, pulling the smaller plants tightly against the soil. The trapped flowers vibrated violently against the hardened mud, leaking thick, dark fluid from their crushed joints. The fluid pooled in the divots of the grid, staining the grey ash a deep, oily black. The drying petals curled inward, emitting a high, piercing hiss as the moisture boiled out of them under the intense pressure of the surrounding growth. The crushing weight of the larger structures ground the weaker flowers down into fine powder. The sounds of cracking wood, dripping sap, and hissing steam filled the air above the board, providing a direct, observable record of the physical destruction occurring within the geometric bounds of the simulation. The gardener leaned over the grid, watching the bright pulses of light racing through the vast network of leaves. The glowing energy traveling through the plant veins matched the exact frequency and color of the heat radiating from the gardener's own hands. On the opposite side of the board, the winnower observed the collapsing grey ash of the crushed stems. The frost spreading across the dying petals held the precise chemical structure and temperature of the ice, clinging to the winnower's heavy black cloak. They observed their own physical properties driving the mechanics of the simulation. The forces of rapid, compounding growth and sharp, immediate reduction were the exact tools they used in the wider garden, now applied in miniature across the intersecting lines of the mud. The board completely filled with these massive, glowing structures. The creeping vines exhausted the available dirt, consuming the remaining water and extracting every jagged mineral from the squares. The dense settlements choked each other out, collapsing under the strain of their own immense weight. The towering pillars of cellulose fractured and tipped over, shattering the thick leaf bridges and burying the mobile clusters in deep mounds of dry debris. The bioluminescence flickered, dimmed, and finally extinguished entirely, leaving the grid covered in a thick, silent layer of grey dust. The gardener reached across the rows, swept the grey dust into the woven satchel, and pressed a fresh handful of seeds into the cleared mud. The winnower scraped the remaining dead roots out of the intersections with the flat edge of the iron blade, carving the grid lines back to their original depth. They set up a new starting arrangement, placing the thick blooms in completely different geometric coordinates. The grid vibrated, and a new variation of structures rapidly assembled themselves from the freshly turned dirt. In one iteration, the flowers grew in wide, perfectly circular rings that expanded outward like ripples in a pond, leaving the inner squares entirely barren and cracked from the heat. In another, they formed sharp, jagged spikes of hardened bark that shot straight upward, piercing the humid air before shattering violently into thousands of heavy wooden splinters. The splinters rained down on the grid, creating a thick bed of shrapnel that choked out the next generation of seeds. They ran the simulation through millions of physical configurations, watching the dirt push up massive floating spheres of pollen, deep subterranean tunnels lined with glowing green moss, and sprawling flat carpets of razor-sharp thorns that shredded any moving cluster attempting to cross them. The gardener and the winnower executed this cycle continuously, clearing the board, smoothing the mud, and planting new seeds to observe every possible physical outcome generated by the grid. Regardless of the countless times the gardener cleared the dirt and planted fresh seeds, the shifting structures on the grid always locked into the exact same final configuration. A specific, singular arrangement of flowers eventually overpowered every other shape on the board, devouring the competing vines and repeating its own geometric pattern endlessly across the mud. The iterations on the vast mud grid ran their mechanical course. The crawling clusters of blooms and the towering pillars of cellulose fractured and expanded, driven by the strict geometric laws of the intersecting lines. Among these sprawling biological settlements, a specific, highly condensed pattern of flowers took root. This pattern formed a tight, interlocking block of thick, grey bark and rigid, inward-facing petals. It anchored itself to the hardened dirt with a series of dense, spiraling taproots that bored directly into the underlying bedrock. As the simulation cycled forward, this grey block began its expansion. The outer edges of the pattern sprouted heavy, barbed vines that lashed out and wrapped around the stems of the adjacent flora. The barbed vines pierced the waxy leaves of the neighboring plants, draining the rushing sap and siphoning the trapped moisture. The grey block pumped a thick, paralyzing resin through these connections, instantly arresting the growth cycle of the captured flowers. The cells of the adjacent plants mutated under the chemical flood, shedding their bright crimson and violet colors. Their structures rigidified, transforming into exact, identical copies of the grey block. The pattern multiplied outward in perfect synchronization. It advanced across the flat expanse of the grid, locking its geometric edges into every organic shape it encountered. When it hit a towering column of intertwined stalks, it dismantled the base, dropping the massive structure into the mud before converting the shattered wood into more grey blocks. When it intersected with a fast-moving, bioluminescent cluster, it absorbed the mobile roots, halting the movement and extinguishing the flashing light. The dense, self-sustaining blocks stacked upon one another, building a uniform, perfectly repeating surface of flat grey bark and tight, rigid petals. The sound of the garden shifted dramatically as the shape took over the board. The chaotic, overlapping chorus of snapping wood, hissing steam, and vibrating insect wings gave way to a singular, rhythmic, mechanical hum. The identical blocks expanded and contracted in absolute unison, pumping fluids through their unified root system with a steady, deafening pulse. The vast network of diverse, competing biology vanished, replaced entirely by this singular, all-consuming structure. The entire visible grid, stretching to the far horizon, locked into this exact geometric configuration. The winnower crouched at the edge of the furrows, resting a pale hand on the heavy iron hilt of the scythe. The dark cloak draped over the freezing mud, absorbing the ambient glow of the garden. The winnower observed the grey blocks, dismantling a sprawling canopy of blue petals. The black firmament above the winnower remained perfectly still. The winnower traced the expanding edge of the dominant pattern with a slow, deliberate movement of a finger, watching the flawless execution of the garden's mechanical rules. The grey shape stripped away the excess foliage, eliminated the weak structures, and established a perfectly ordered, indestructible perimeter. The winnower gave a short, firm nod, acknowledging the absolute efficiency of the sprawling blocks. On the opposite side of the grid, the gardener paced along the intersecting lines. The blinding white light, radiating from the gardener's skin, flared intensely, scorching the wet soil and sending thick plumes of steam into the humid air. The gardener plunged glowing hands into the woven satchel, pulling out massive clumps of pulsating seeds. The gardener hurled the seeds directly into the path of the advancing grey blocks, forcing sudden eruptions of bright green vines and thick, explosive blooms to sprout from the mud. The grey pattern absorbed the new growth instantly. The barbed vines of the dominant shape latched onto the erupting green shoots, flooding them with resin and converting their biological mass before they could even fully unfurl their leaves. The gardener threw more seeds, stacking thick walls of rapid growth against the grey perimeter. The dominant pattern simply consumed the walls, using the massive influx of raw material to accelerate its own expansion across the grid. The gardener stopped throwing seeds and dug glowing fingers deeply into the packed dirt, leaving long, burning trenches in the mud. The physical tension in the gardener's frame radiated intense waves of heat across the furrows, baking the grey ash into hardened glass. The two entities cleared the board and started the simulation over. The gardener arranged the initial flowers in wide, separated circles at the farthest edges of the grid. The winnower placed single blooms in long, diagonal lines across the center. They withdrew their hands and let the dirt vibrate. The organic shapes expanded, fought for resources, and mutated into complex settlements. Then, deep within a cluster of crawling vines, the tight, interlocking grey block materialized. It sprouted its barbed vines, pierced the neighboring stems, and began its identical march across the grid. They wiped the mud flat again and set up a new geometry, placing every flower in a massive, dense square right in the center. The board ran its course. The sprawling canopy collapsed, the grey block emerged from the debris, and the uniform surface of perfectly repeating bark consumed the entire field. They ran the simulation using asymmetrical steps, vertical columns, and scattered, random placements. Every single iteration ended in the exact same physical state. The grey shape devoured the board, eliminated every other biological structure, and locked the grid into a state of absolute, unbending uniformity. The winnower stood quietly, watching the grey blocks pulse in unison across the vast expanse. The gardener remained near the edge of the board, staring down at the unbreakable, repeating pattern. The gardener's hands closed into tight fists, crushing the remaining seeds in the woven satchel until bright green sap dripped onto the hardened glass of the furrows. The heat radiating from the gardener intensified, causing the air above the board to shimmer and warp. The gardener stepped forward, driving a glowing foot heavily into the edge of the uniform grey grid, cracking the thick bark of the nearest block. The gardener lifted a glowing foot from the cracked bark of the grey block, leaving a scorched footprint pressed deeply into the thick cellulose. The intense heat boiled the resin inside the block, sending a thin column of white steam into the damp air. The winnower reached across the grid with a dark iron blade, hooking the curved metal under the damaged block and prying it from the hardened mud. The winnower scraped the rest of the board flat, sweeping the ash and debris over the edge, exposing the bare lines once more. The gardener opened the woven satchel, pulled out another handful of heavy seeds, and pushed them directly into the center of the grid. They stepped back, allowing the physical mechanics of the intersecting lines to govern the next iteration. The fresh seeds ruptured under the mud, pushing a dense canopy of wide, blue leaves and thick, barbed vines upward. The flora expanded rapidly, forming a towering structure of overlapping stems that dripped with condensation and vibrated with the hum of crawling insects. A secondary pattern of bright crimson blooms materialized on the outer edges, utilizing a series of horizontal roots to slide across the dirt and intercept the blue leaves. The two structures collided, grinding their stems together and leaking bright sap onto the grid. The simulation produced a massive, sprawling settlement of diverse biological forms, constantly shifting and competing for the available moisture. Then, deep within the center of the tangle, the exact same geometric configuration locked into place. A tight, uniform block of gray bark and rigid petals formed from the crushed remains of the lower vines. The block extruded heavy, barbed roots, piercing the thick stems of the blue and crimson flowers. It pumped the paralyzing resin into the adjacent plants, instantly converting their cells into identical gray blocks. The dominant pattern began its mechanical expansion, moving outward in perfectly synchronized steps. It crushed the towering structures, collapsed the suspended leaf bridges, and absorbed the crawling clusters. The diverse settlement vanished under the advancing line of gray bark. The grid locked into the uniform, repeating pattern, filling the entire visible space with the identical, vibrating blocks. They ran the simulation again. The gardener planted a long, continuous row of seeds along the farthest edge of the board. The winnower placed a single, massive bloom in the exact center. The organic shapes expanded, generating a spinning rotor of yellow pollen and a crawling wave of jagged thorns. The grid pulsed with rapid movement. The gray block materialized at the intersection of the rotor and the wave. It seized the rotating petals, injected the resin, and multiplied across the entire board. The spinning shapes stopped. The identical gray bark covered every square of the mud. They continued this process, wiping the dirt flat and arranging the flowers in millions of distinct geometric combinations. The gardener piled seeds into towering mounds, scattered them in wide, sparse arcs, and buried them deep beneath the intersections. The winnower positioned the heavy blooms in dense rectangles, tight spirals, and long, overlapping chains. The board generated floating spheres of vines, subterranean tunnels of hardened roots, and massive, oscillating pillars of cellulose. Every single arrangement produced the exact same final shape. The gray block always emerged from the complex growth, established its rigid perimeter, and devoured the rest of the board. The final shape executed a physical sequence of absolute efficiency, stripping away the varied structures and replacing them with a perfectly uniform, indestructible surface. The final shape subsumed all other patterns, feeding on their biological mass to accelerate its own expansion. The winnower observed the final shape with steady, unblinking focus. The winnower stepped onto the grid, pressing a heavy boot onto the flat surface of the gray bark. The block held its shape perfectly under the immense pressure, vibrating with a steady mechanical pulse. The winnower crouched down, running a pale finger along the tight seams between the identical squares. The pattern demonstrated complete physical dominance, eliminating the weak, unstable growth and establishing a permanent, ordered perimeter. The winnower tapped the iron hilt of the scythe against the gray bark, producing a sharp, metallic chime that echoed across the field. The final shape operated with the same ruthless, immediate reduction as the dark blade, enforcing absolute limits on the chaotic overgrowth. The winnower nodded at the identical, self-sustaining blocks. The gardener paced violently along the outer edge of the grid. The blinding light radiating from the gardener flared intensely, baking the wet mud into brittle, shattered clay. The gardener dug glowing hands into the woven satchel, crushing the remaining seeds into a thick, bright green paste. The paste dripped from the gardener's fingers, burning deep, smoking divots into the packed dirt. The gardener dragged a heavy foot through the mud, kicking clods of dried earth onto the perfectly clean surface of the gray bark. The heat warping the air above the gardener caused the firmament to shimmer and distort. The all-consuming nature of the final shape prevented the grid from supporting any other biological structures. The gardener wanted to observe the sprawling canopies, the flashing bioluminescence, and the creeping vines, watching them mutate across the intersections. The final shape locked the board into a static state, shutting down the continuous growth of the light. The identical grey blocks choked out the possibility of any new forms rising from the mud. The gardener stopped pacing, standing rigidly at the edge of the grey squares. The blinding aura flared white, sending a wave of searing heat across the board, cracking the uppermost layer of the bark. The gardener turned toward the winnower, breaking the long silence of the garden to address this repeating trap. The gardener pointed a glowing hand at the completely grey board, stepping directly over the boundary of the carved dirt. The intense light, radiating from the gardener's skin, cast sharp, stark shadows across the identical blocks of bark. The gardener stared at the unbroken grid, breathing heavily, sending rapid bursts of hot steam into the air. "It always ends the same," the gardener said. The words caused the puddles in the mud to vibrate violently, sending silver droplets spraying over the surface of the nearest flowers. The heat rolling off the gardener intensified, singeing the wet dirt and cracking the frozen sap. The gardener paced along the edge of the identical grey squares, striking the flat surface of the blocks with the toe of a glowing foot. The rigid bark held firm, absorbing the impact with a dull, heavy thud. The gardener pointed down at the board again, dragging a burning finger through the air, just above the repeating pattern. "This one stupid pattern," the gardener said. The deep vibrations of the voice rattled the overlapping leaves in the outer canopy, causing the segmented insects to drop from the vines and scatter across the damp soil. The gardener kicked another block, harder this time, chipping a small fragment of bark from the edge of the square. The fragment slid across the flat grid, coming to rest against another identical edge. The gardener stepped back, running both hands through the blinding, formless light that shaped their upper body. The physical frustration was evident in the rapid shifting of the aura, pulsing erratically from bright white to blinding yellow. The gardener gestured sharply at the vast, uniform expanse. They wanted the board to remain active, to keep pushing up the complex webs of competing roots, to maintain the chaotic friction of the simulation. The grey block stopped all of that. It locked the dirt into a single, unbreakable configuration, halting the physical generation of new structures. The gardener found this absolute stasis deeply irritating. The continuous failure to push the simulation past this singular endpoint vexed the gardener entirely, embedding a deep, persistent annoyance into the very core of the light. The winnower stood perfectly still at the opposite end of the board, leaning the heavy iron scythe against a shoulder. The black cloak hung motionless in the freezing air, anchoring the winnower's shape against the dark firmament. The winnower looked at the gardener, then looked down at the grey grid. "They are majestic," the winnower answered. The voice was smooth and even, producing a low rumble that froze the moisture in the air into fine, crystalline dust. The words carried no anger, no volume, and no frustration. The winnower simply stated the physical reality of the board. The winnower pointed a pale finger at the exact center of the repeating blocks. The dominant pattern possessed no secondary characteristics. It did not build suspended bridges or generate bioluminescent networks. It existed solely to convert every other biological mass into its own rigid structure. It stripped away all complexity and replaced it with absolute, unbreakable uniformity. They have no purpose except to subsume all other purposes, the winnower continued. The cold air, radiating from the cloak, drifted across the grid, settling into the narrow cracks between the squares. The winnower admired the physical efficiency of the blocks. The pattern perfectly executed the exact mechanics the winnower employed during the evening harvest. It cleared the chaotic overgrowth and reduced the garden to its strongest, most resilient form. The shape did exactly what it was designed to do, without hesitation and without error. The winnower found deep satisfaction in observing a system that naturally reduced itself to a single, perfect point of order. The grey shape was the ultimate physical expression of the winnower's own nature. The gardener slammed a glowing fist into the palm of the other hand, creating a sharp crack of displaced air that echoed across the field. The gardener refused to accept the finality of the shape. The gardener wanted the simulation to run infinitely, constantly generating new, fragile, and beautiful geometries. The static, indestructible blocks represented a total failure of the gardener's primary function. The two entities stood on opposite sides of the locked grid, separated by the endless expanse of grey bark, physically embodying the exact point of their divergence. The gardener demanded endless variation. The winnower demanded an absolute conclusion. The physical mechanics of the board had forced this contradiction directly to the surface. The winnower stepped fully onto the frozen squares of the dominant pattern, the iron scythe held loosely in one hand. The black cloak dragged heavily against the perfectly repeating bark, leaving a thin trail of white frost on the identical grey blocks. The winnower did not pace or radiate intense heat. The freezing air surrounding the winnower remained completely undisturbed by the flashing light of the gardener's aura. The winnower observed the gardener's violent frustration from the center of the static grid, standing tall and perfectly upright. To the winnower, the garden operated exactly as it was supposed to. The grid functioned on pure, mechanical logic, and that logic demanded an absolute conclusion. The winnower did not view the identical grey blocks as a failure of the simulation, but rather as the simulation's ultimate success. The complex canopies, the crawling vines, and the flashing blooms were merely temporary arrangements of biological mass, inefficient and bound to collapse. The final shape proved its superiority by surviving the unyielding rules of the intersecting lines and subsuming everything else. It demonstrated the exact physical truth of the garden. Whatever could not defend its own existence would be destroyed, and whatever remained would dominate the space completely. The winnower held no jealousy toward the gardener's ability to plant the seeds. The winnower did not desire the power to force thick shoots from the wet mud, or to weave sprawling leaf bridges across the empty air. The winnower recognized that the seeds needed to be planted so they could grow, compete, and eventually be cut down. The two forces held entirely separate, clearly defined dominions. The gardener provided the raw, unshaped mass, and the winnower provided the final, perfected form. The winnower found this arrangement completely satisfactory, viewing the endless cycle of planting and reaping as the only honest state of existence. There was no malice in the winnower's reduction of the garden. When the dark blade sliced through the frozen trunks during the evening harvest, it did not strike out of anger. It struck because the trunks were weak, overgrown, and suffocating the stronger stems beneath them. The winnower simply executed the physical law of necessity. The grey pattern operating on the grid applied the exact same law. It encountered competing shapes, overpowered them, and converted their mass into its own rigid structure. It did not hate the blue petals or the creeping vines. It merely outlasted them. The winnower respected the absolute mechanical purity of that process. The gardener's furious pacing and intense, searing heat seemed entirely irrational to the winnower. The gardener wanted the simulation to keep producing fragile, unstable geometries that could never survive the strict rules of the board. The gardener wanted to protect the weak, the complex, and the inefficient. The winnower observed this desire as a fundamental flaw, a refusal to accept the reality of the dirt grid. If a shape could not maintain its own borders, it did not deserve the space it occupied. The grey blocks earned the right to exist by physically eliminating all other options. The winnower spoke again, the voice rolling low and steady across the frozen bark. The vibrations did not shake the leaves or crack the mud. They simply filled the cold air with a heavy, physical weight. "They are the inevitable result of our game," the winnower said, gesturing toward the uniform expanse. The winnower pointed the dark iron blade at the unbroken line of identical squares. "They have proven their right to this space. They outlasted the rest, and so they remain." The winnower believed that the rules of the garden were perfect, and the outcome of the simulation was the absolute proof of that perfection. The identical grey blocks were not a trap. They were the final, correct answer to the equation the two entities had set up in the mud. The winnower stood firmly anchored in this belief, waiting for the gardener's intense heat to subside, waiting for the realization that the game had already been won by the only shape strong enough to claim the victory. However, the gardener's aura only flared brighter, projecting a blinding glare that forced the shadows in the garden to retreat sharply behind the winnower's heavy boots. The physical tension between the two entities, born from the results of the flower game, compressed the air between them into a rigid, heavy barrier. The winnower raised the dark iron scythe, resting the flat side of the heavy blade across the front of the black cloak. The cold metal absorbed the glaring light cast by the gardener, throwing a long, sharp shadow across the identical grey blocks. The winnower tapped a pale finger against the thick iron spine of the weapon, producing a dull, flat ring that sank quickly into the frozen mud. "I discovered the first knife," the winnower said. The low rumble of the voice vibrated the ice crystals clinging to the bark of the dominant pattern. The winnower did not forge the blade in a fire or pull it from a stone. The knife emerged physically from the exact mechanics of the garden itself. When the winnower observed the sprawling canopy of blue petals suffocating the weaker stems beneath it, the necessity of the cut manifested as a physical tool. The knife was the physical boundary that separated one living thing from another. It was the sharp edge of the frost that snapped the fragile vines, the absolute limit that stopped the rapid expansion of the creeping roots. The winnower pointed the curved tip of the scythe down at the identical squares of the final shape. The grey blocks utilized the exact same physical principle. When their barbed roots pierced the neighboring flowers and flooded them with paralyzing resin, they executed the function of the knife. They cut away the other possibilities. The winnower recognized the shape because it operated with the same ruthless efficiency as the iron blade held in the winnower's hand. The gardener's bright, shapeless form vibrated violently, sending rapid pulses of white-hot steam rolling over the packed dirt. The heat striking the winnower's cloak instantly turned the white frost into heavy drops of water, which dripped down into the frozen mud and immediately crystallized again. The gardener dug glowing hands into the sides of the woven satchel, gripping the coarse fabric tightly enough to tear the seams. Bright green sap leaked from the tear, sizzling as it hit the glass-like surface of the scorched furrows. The winnower continued, the voice remaining entirely flat and devoid of inflection. The garden could not sustain infinite growth. If every seed planted by the gardener survived, the physical space would become a solid, crushing block of wood and sap. choking itself out in a matter of hours. The winnower explained the biological reality of the dirt. Life required death to make room. The complex canopies and the flashing bioluminescent clusters could only exist temporarily because the winnower constantly cleared the space beneath them. The cut was not an act of malice. It was the mechanism that allowed the garden to function. The winnower swept the dark blade in a wide arc above the grid. The motion displaced the cold air, sending a freezing wind cutting straight through the heavy heat radiating from the gardener. The wind struck the grey blocks, producing a sharp, whistling sound as it rushed over the repeating patterns of the bark. The winnower argued that the final shape merely accelerated this necessary process. It bypassed the long, chaotic struggle of the creeping vines and the towering pillars, moving directly to the end state. It applied the knife perfectly, eliminating the weak structures and securing the entire board. The gardener dropped the woven satchel onto the scorched dirt. The heavy bag hit the ground with a wet thud, spilling the remaining seeds across the flat, cracked surface of the mud. The seeds pulsed with bright light, but they did not take root. They simply rolled against the solid edge of the nearest grey block and stopped. The gardener stared down at the unmoving seeds, then looked up at the winnower. The bright aura surrounding the gardener compressed, pulling inward until it formed a dense, blindingly white silhouette. The physical tension between the two entities reached a breaking point. The winnower held the dark blade perfectly still, anchored by the cold certainty of the harvest. The winnower saw the final shape as the only honest outcome of the grid, the inevitable result of applying the knife to a field of infinite growth. The gardener, radiating a condensed, searing heat, refused to accept this absolute conclusion. The static grey blocks offended the core function of the light, and the gardener prepared to alter the physical conditions of the board to break the hold of the dominant pattern. The gardener stared across the flat expanse of the grey blocks, the blinding light radiating from their form, intensifying until the edges of the grid began to smoke. The heat baked the wet dirt beneath the blocks, causing the mud to crack and split open in wide fissures. The gardener swept a glowing hand over the board, ignoring the rigid petals and the hardened bark. The simulation had run its course, ending in the same static uniformity. The gardener refused to leave the grid in this state. The fundamental rules of the game restricted the physical growth to this single, inevitable conclusion, and the gardener required variation. "I am going to do something about it," the gardener said. The bright heat surrounding the gardener pulsed, sending a shockwave across the mud that shattered the closest row of grey squares into fine dust. The gardener proposed a wager, a physical alteration to the mechanics of the dirt grid. The existing rules forced the game to end by eliminating every fragile, complex structure. The gardener outlined a new parameter. This new rule would actively reward complexity. It would physically intervene when a sprawling settlement of vines and petals was threatened by the rigid grey blocks. The gardener wanted to inject a spontaneous variable into the board, an unpredictable force that could bypass the rigid logic of the intersecting lines. If a towering canopy of blue leaves began to collapse under its own weight, this new rule would stabilize the structure, allowing it to grow taller and branch further than the original parameters permitted. It would create a permanent space for the fragile and the strange. The winnower stepped back from the edge of the grid, the heavy, dark scythe scraping against the frozen mud. The black cloak flared out, absorbing the intense light pushing across the field. The cold, radiating from the winnower, thickened, forming jagged spikes of ice along the edge of the board, physical barriers against the gardener's surging heat. "You cannot do that," the winnower stated. The low rumble of the voice vibrated the ice spikes, causing them to hum with a sharp, warning tone. The winnower argued against the physical consequences of the gardener's wager. The entire garden functioned on the premise of separation and conclusion. If the gardener introduced a rule that rewarded complexity and bypassed the natural collapse of unstable structures, the grid would fill with malformed, impossible growth. The creeping vines would never die off. They would simply stack upon each other endlessly, creating a massive, rotting tumor of biological mass. The blue petals would expand until they suffocated everything else on the board, locked in a state of continuous, agonizing overgrowth. The winnower saw this new rule not as a spark of variation, but as a total corruption of the physical laws that kept the dirt clean and the furrows distinct. The gardener ignored the rising wall of ice. The white-hot light surrounding the gardener intensified further, blinding and formless, pushing directly against the freezing air of the winnower's domain. The heat melted the tips of the ice spikes, sending streams of freezing water running into the cracked mud. The gardener intended to execute the wager regardless of the winnower's objection. The simulation needed to break free from the grey block, and the gardener was willing to fundamentally alter the mechanics of the space to achieve that result. "We are going to play a new game," the gardener said. The heat rolling off the gardener scorched the air, carrying the heavy scent of burning ozone and vaporized sap. The gardener raised both glowing hands above the grid, preparing to push the new parameter directly into the dirt. The winnower tightened a pale grip on the iron hilt of the scythe. The dark metal groaned under the pressure, the surface shifting like an oily film. The winnower understood the exact physical implication of the gardener's action. The garden was a closed system. It contained no external forces, no outside materials, and no secondary observers. The gardener and the winnower were the absolute foundation of the space. If the gardener intended to introduce a new, active rule into the simulation, there was only one physical source that could provide that parameter. The gardener intended to insert their own raw power into the grid. The blinding light itself was about to become a playable piece on the board. The winnower recognized the immediate structural danger this posed to the entire garden, preparing the dark blade to physically intercept the alteration. The gardener thrust both glowing hands downward, driving them completely through the hardened surface of the grey blocks and directly into the intersecting lines of the mud. The intense, blinding light surrounding the gardener did not merely scorch the dirt, it fused with it. The heat poured into the grooves of the grid, filling the geometric channels with a liquid, searing luminescence. The gardener physically bound their own essence to the mechanical structure of the board. By taking this action, the gardener established a new precedent within the closed system of the garden. The entities tending the soil could insert themselves into the simulation as active, playable rules. The effect on the board was instantaneous. The rigid grey blocks immediately surrounding the gardener shattered, unable to maintain their structure against the sudden influx of raw, unfiltered light. Where the blocks collapsed, new shapes erupted from the boiling mud. These were not the standard blue petals or creeping vines. They were highly complex, unstable geometries that defied the original mechanics of the grid. Massive spiraling towers of semi-transparent cellulose twisted upward, supported by an internal pressure that prevented them from falling. Spheres of contained moisture hovered inches above the dirt, defying the pull of gravity. The light provided the necessary force to sustain these impossible structures, directly rewarding their complexity and allowing them to expand without being crushed by their own weight. The winnower observed the blinding liquid light filling the lines of the board. The winnower saw the grey blocks shattering and the impossible towers rising in their place. The strict, unyielding logic of the simulation had been broken. The gardener had physically forced open a space where inefficient, weak structures could survive indefinitely. The winnower recognized that if this new rule went unchecked, the garden would lose all definition. The sprawling, unstable biology would stack upon itself until the entire field became a rotting, paralyzed mass of overgrowth. Because the gardener had made the act of altering the game a valid move, the winnower was immediately forced to respond in kind. The winnower could not simply sweep the board flat or kick the dirt over the lines. To counter the active presence of the light, the winnower had to become an active rule within the mud. The winnower drove the heavy iron scythe straight down, sinking the black metal deep into the center of the grid. The cold, radiating from the winnower, poured down the handle of the blade, flooding the intersecting lines with a thick, heavy shadow. The freezing darkness rushed through the channels, chasing the liquid light across the board. The winnower embedded their own absolute limits directly into the simulation. Where the gardener provided the force for impossible complexity, the winnower became the force of absolute simplicity and reduction. The grey blocks, previously shattered by the light, reformed instantly upon contact with the heavy shadow. They hardened into structures even denser and more resilient than before. The barbed roots grew thicker, coated in a layer of black frost that immediately froze the rushing sap of the complex towers. The blocks surged forward, driven by the active presence of the darkness. They slammed into the hovering spheres of moisture, dropping them to the dirt and crushing them into ice. They severed the bases of the spiraling towers, collapsing the impossible structures and rapidly converting the debris back into identical, repeating squares. The entire surface of the grid became a massive, churning collision between the two localized rules. The liquid light forced spontaneous rapid mutations, pushing up jagged reefs of bioluminescent crystal and thick webs of burning roots. The heavy shadow followed immediately behind, dragging the grey blocks forward to crush the crystals and freeze the roots solid. The physical mechanics of the board fractured under the immense pressure of these two opposing forces operating simultaneously within the confined space of the mud. The gardener and the winnower remained anchored to the grid, their hands and weapons buried in the dirt. The heat and the cold radiated from them, invisible solid waves, distorting the atmosphere and creating violent updrafts that tore the broad leaves from the surrounding canopy. The quiet, repetitive exercise of arranging flowers had completely ceased. The two fundamental principles of the garden were now fully immersed in the dirt, their physical properties grinding directly against one another across every single intersection. The structured simulation broke down entirely, replaced by a raw, immediate exchange of power. The gardener poured continuous energy into the system to sustain the chaotic growth, and the winnower answered with continuous reduction to force the system back to the final shape. The gardener and the winnower abandoned the flower game, their hands tearing into the very mud that formed the foundation of the garden. The winnower stepped forward, swinging the heavy iron scythe directly at the blinding, formless shape of the gardener. The dark metal sheared through the intense heat, colliding with the gardener's glowing arm. The impact produced a deafening crack that shattered the hardened clay beneath their feet. The gardener absorbed the blow without breaking posture and retaliated, driving a blazing fist directly into the winnower's chest. The white-hot impact scorched the heavy black cloak, boiling the surrounding frost instantly into a thick, scalding fog. They grappled in the center of the ruined grid, exchanging massive, concussive blows that tore up the earth. The sheer physical force of their conflict destabilized the environment around them. When the gardener slammed the winnower into the dirt, the displaced mud erupted outward in towering waves. These waves did not fall back as dirt. The friction of their bodies ground the soil down to its most basic components, igniting the dust into raw, explosive plasma. The winnower pushed upward, driving the iron scythe through the plasma, the cold blade freezing the expanding energy into dense, metallic asteroids that crashed heavily back into the garden. Their fight spread beyond the boundaries of the carved board, crushing the overgrown furrows they had previously tended. They smashed through the towering, fused pillars of cellulose, splintering the dense wood into millions of flying fragments. The winnower swung the blade in wide, horizontal arcs, severing entire canopies of broad blue leaves in an attempt to strike the gardener. The severed leaves fell into the burning trenches left by the gardener's footprints, catching fire immediately. The air filled with thick, black smoke, the smell of vaporized sap, and the continuous roar of shattering timber. The struggle pushed them toward the exact center of the furrows, directly into the massive trunk of the silver tree. The winnower drove the gardener backward, slamming the glowing figure into the pale bark. The impact violently shook the tree, dislodging thousands of the interlocking metallic feathers. The silver quills rained down around them, burying their heavy boots in a thick layer of glittering metal. The gardener pushed off the trunk, unleashing a continuous torrent of blinding heat that engulfed the winnower. The thermal shock wave hit the massive structure of the tree, boiling the rushing sap inside the wood. The pressure inside the trunk built rapidly as the sap turned to steam. The thick bark blistered and split open, releasing jets of high-pressure vapor. The winnower lunged forward through the blinding light, driving a heavy boot into the gardener's chest, shoving the glowing figure back against the damaged wood. The combined weight of their struggling forms, combined with the explosive internal pressure of the boiling sap, proved too much for the massive plant. The thick, smooth roots, anchoring the tree to the bedrock, snapped with a sound like firing artillery. The massive trunk splintered, twisting violently before collapsing entirely. The crown of the silver tree crashed down into the mud, crushing the remaining beds of flowers and burying the crawling insects under thousands of tons of heavy wood and metallic feathers. The impact sent a massive shockwave rolling across the entire garden, flattening the few standing stalks and violently displacing the pooled water. The garden's central structure, the single anchor point that had bloomed and shed its feathers endlessly since the beginning, was reduced to a jagged, smoking stump. The destruction of the tree marked a total physical collapse of the environment. The gardener and the winnower continued to trade heavy, destructive blows over the shattered trunk. Every time their forces collided, the physical reaction ripped wider holes in the fabric of the garden. The concentrated bursts of searing light and freezing darkness did not just destroy the flora, they ignited the probability space itself. Where the winnower's blade met the gardener's hands, the resulting friction spat out raw, unstable matter. They were no longer just fighting. They were violently compressing the unchosen possibilities of the mud into dense, expanding pockets of real, physical substance. The dirt beneath them boiled and liquefied, spinning into swirling accretion disks of superheated gas and heavy metals. The ice shattered by the winnower's cloak melted, reformed, and expanded into vast clouds of frozen hydrogen. The conflict between the two entities generated immense gravitational shears, pulling the raw material of the ruined flowers and the splintered tree into tight, burning spheres. The garden, previously a flat, stable plain of dirt and furrows, began to violently fracture, giving way to the expanding, burning mass of a newly birthed physical universe. The entities continued to wrestle amidst the expanding plasma, their ongoing exchange of force directly fueling the massive, outward explosion of matter and energy. The raw exchange of power between the gardener and the winnower ripped the mud grid completely apart. The intersecting lines dissolved into a boiling slurry of superheated dust and liquid light. The physical boundary that contained their simulation fractured, allowing the immense pressure generated by their struggle to vent directly into the previously empty space surrounding the garden. The forces of rapid, compounding growth and sharp, immediate reduction, once restricted to the placement of flowers, now applied themselves directly to the raw matter tearing loose from the furrows. The two entities remained locked together, tearing at each other with glowing hands and the dark iron scythe. Every collision produced a violent displacement of mass. When the gardener forced a burst of blinding heat into the winnower's chest, the resulting shockwave threw thousands of tons of liquefied rock outward. As the rock flew through the freezing air radiating from the winnower's cloak, it rapidly cooled, condensing into dense, spinning spheres of heavy metals and silicates. When the winnower drove the black blade into the bright aura of the gardener, the friction ignited the surrounding hydrogen, sparking massive, sustained fusion reactions. The physical structure of the garden completely unraveled. The deep bedrock shattered, releasing trapped pockets of primordial water that instantly vaporized, adding massive columns of steam to the expanding accretion disks. The continuous, alternating application of the gardener's heat and the winnower's freezing cold forged the physical laws of a new universe in real time. The heat pushed matter apart, forcing expansion and complex chemical bonding. The cold pulled matter together, establishing gravity, density, and absolute limits on atomic structures. Their fight translated the abstract rules of the flower game into physical mechanics, setting the exact parameters for how energy would move through a vacuum and how mass would interact. The destruction of the garden released the patterns that had been trapped within the simulation. Without the strict boundaries of the mud grid to contain them, these geometric shapes fled the epicenter of the conflict. The crawling clusters of blooms, the oscillating pillars of cellulose, and the rigid gray blocks did not maintain their plant-like forms. Stripped of the dirt and the sap, they reverted to pure, abstract mathematics. They became self-executing equations, tumbling blindly through the expanding plasma. The gray blocks, the final shape that had dominated the board, proved the most resilient. The raw mathematics of this pattern held together perfectly, absorbing the immense heat and radiation of the expanding universe without degrading. It functioned precisely as it had on the grid, locking its structural parameters and shielding its core logic from the surrounding chaos. The pattern spun through the boiling clouds of heavy elements, riding the outward shockwaves generated by the fighting entities. The physical universe expanded rapidly in all directions, a chaotic burning sphere of newly forged matter. The gardener and the winnower remained at the center, their continuous struggle acting as the engine driving the expansion. The raw force of their blows pushed the borders of the universe further outward, creating vast, empty vacuums between the spinning clusters of gas and rock. The blinding light and the deep shadows stretched across the new cosmos, establishing the fundamental baseline of radiation and dark matter. The abstract patterns fleeing the garden slammed into the newly formed physical structures. The equations governing complex, inefficient growth collided with the burning stars, instantly burning out and scattering their loose mathematics into the solar winds. Only the most robust, tightly packed algorithms survived the transition. The mathematics of the gray blocks, the highly optimized code of the final shape, navigated the violent currents of the early universe. The pattern sought out the most stable environments, moving away from the searing heat of the fusion reactions and the crushing gravity of the dense metallic cores. The universe continued to expand, the heat of the initial explosion slowly dissipating into the stretching vacuum. The swirling clouds of hydrogen and helium cooled, clumping together to form the first generations of massive, unstable stars. The heavier elements forged in the destruction of the garden gathered in the outer orbits, spinning into massive, rocky bodies covered in thick, toxic atmospheres. The physical laws established by the gardener and the winnower settled into permanent, measurable constants. The raw mathematics of the final shape drifted through this cooling expanse, searching for a physical medium capable of supporting its rigid logic. The pattern required a substrate, a material it could infect and reorganize according to its own absolute rules. The abstract equation moved through the vacuum, riding the electromagnetic currents generated by the newborn stars, searching the cooling rocks and the gathering ice for a foothold. The universe was no longer a flat grid of dirt. It was a massive, three-dimensional volume of raw material, waiting to be shaped. The violent explosion of the primordial garden scattered the raw mathematics of the simulation outward, casting the abstract equations into the dense, burning soup of the newly birthed universe. These surviving geometric patterns, no longer anchored to the flat mud of the grid, tumbled helplessly through a completely hostile environment. The stable vacuum they required did not yet exist. Instead, they found themselves trapped inside the rapid, chaotic expansion of hypercompressed plasma. The immense heat generated by the continuous fusion reactions warped their structural logic, forcing the equations to bend and distort to avoid total erasure. The patterns crashed against the localized gravitational fields forming around the earliest, supermassive stars. The intense gravity sheared the weaker algorithms apart, stripping away the lines of code that governed the sprawling blue canopies and the flashing bioluminescent clusters. Only the absolute core logic remained intact. The dense, highly optimized mechanics of the gray blocks. This remaining code, the final shape that had dominated the dirt grid, compressed itself into tight, microscopic loops. These loops scurried through the quantum foam, darting between the crushing weight of the forming elements. They operated as pure, abstract data, desperate to escape the continuous explosions tearing through the early cosmos. They rode the shockwaves generated by the collapsing stars, spinning outward into the cooler, darker edges of the expanding universe. As the ambient temperature dropped, the swirling clouds of hydrogen gas and free-floating silicates condensed into massive orbital disks. The microscopic loops of code slammed into these debris fields, embedding themselves into the heavy, jagged asteroids and the thick, frozen comets. The comets provided the first stable physical medium since the destruction of the garden. The thick layers of ice shielded the abstract equations from the searing radiation of the nearby stars. Deep within the core of these frozen bodies, pockets of primordial water remained liquid, trapped under immense pressure. The code of the final shape seeped into this dark, saline meltwater. Suspended within the liquid, the abstract mathematics began to interact directly with the physical elements. The code utilized rapid quantum fluctuations to force chemical reactions that would otherwise be impossible in the freezing, lightless environment. The equations organized the free-floating carbon and silicates in the water, binding the atoms together into complex, repeating molecular chains. The abstract logic of the gray blocks translated itself into physical, biological structures. These new structures emerged as microscopic, geometric organisms suspended in the dark water. They possessed rigid, silica-based outer shells that mimicked the tight, interlocking squares of the board. Inside the shells, a thick, milky fluid circulated, carrying the electrical impulses that executed the core logic of the pattern. The code had successfully converted itself from abstract mathematics into a physical, self-replicating organism. The comets carrying these microscopic organisms fell out of their stable orbits, dragged downward by the gravity of the newly formed rocky planets. The massive blocks of ice plummeted through the thick, toxic atmospheres of these early worlds, striking the barren crust with devastating force. The impacts shattered the comets, releasing thousands of tons of the infected meltwater onto the surface. The microscopic organisms washed across the hot, barren rock, pooling in the deep craters and the steaming impact trenches. The silica shells protected them from the extreme heat and the corrosive atmospheric gases. The milky fluid inside the shells pulsed, executing the exact mechanics of the final shape. The organisms immediately sought out the heavy minerals embedded in the rock, using their quantum chemistry to break down the silicates and extract the raw material. They reproduced rapidly, multiplying across the wet stone. They fused their rigid shells together, building massive, uniform structures that spread over the impact sites. They did not build sprawling canopies or fragile vines. They built dense, perfectly repeating blocks of silica and hardened metal. They transformed the chaotic, jagged surface of the barren planets into flat, highly ordered grids. The organisms operated with absolute efficiency, stripping away the loose debris and replacing it with their own indestructible architecture. The pattern of the final shape had successfully survived the transition from the mud grid to the physical universe. It carried the exact same unyielding logic it had demonstrated in the garden. It encountered raw, unshaped environments, overpowered the existing physical conditions, and converted the available mass into its own rigid structure. It demonstrated the exact physical truth of the Winnower's philosophy. Whatever could not defend its own existence would be destroyed, and whatever remained would dominate the space completely. The organisms spread across the surface of the new planets, their physical expansion matching the exact geometric progression of the gray blocks. They connected their uniform structures into vast planetary networks, pumping the milky fluid through deep subterranean channels. The hum of their rapid, synchronized reproduction echoed across the empty, steaming rocks, announcing the arrival of the final shape in the physical universe. The pattern had found its foothold, and it immediately began the slow, mechanical process of subsuming the surrounding cosmos. The microscopic organisms spread across the cooling rocks of the early planets, expanding their rigid grids outward from the impact craters. These structures were built entirely from raw silica, forged by extracting silicon and oxygen atoms from the surrounding stone and binding them into precise, repeating squares. The silica shells functioned as a physical barrier against the harsh radiation and toxic gases of the young atmosphere. Inside the shells, the organisms pumped a milky white fluid through a network of microscopic tubes. This fluid was not a sap or a resin. It was a highly conductive liquid composed of water, dissolved salts, and complex molecular chains. The milky fluid acted as the physical carrier for the core logic of the final shape. It circulated through the silica shells, carrying the mathematical equations that drove the organism's behavior. When the fluid pumped into a specific section of the shell, it triggered a series of rapid, coordinated movements. The microscopic structures extended tiny, jointed legs, gripping the rough stone and pulling themselves forward. They extended long, thin probes into the dirt, identifying the mineral composition and calculating the exact chemical reactions required to break it down. The organisms operated as a unified, synchronized network. The milky fluid did not just circulate within individual shells, it flowed between them. When two organisms connected their shells, they opened microscopic valves, allowing the white fluid to mix. This exchange transferred data, perfectly aligning their movements and sharing the chemical resources they had extracted from the rock. As the network grew, the fluid formed a continuous, flowing body of information, spanning millions of individual silica housings. They encountered pools of stagnant water, bubbling with volcanic heat and thick with dissolved minerals. The organisms marched directly into the pools, their heavy silica shells sinking to the bottom. They opened their valves and released small quantities of the milky fluid into the water. The fluid reacted instantly with the heat and the minerals, synthesizing new proteins and forming fresh molecular chains. The organisms used these new materials to rapidly assemble more silica housings, expanding their grid across the floor of the pool. The physical mechanics of the final shape drove every action. The organisms did not build inefficient structures or waste resources on decorative petals. They constructed only the absolute minimum necessary to house the milky fluid and execute the code. They built dense, perfectly flat blocks of silica that maximized the available space and provided the strongest possible defense against the environment. They layered these blocks upon each other, creating thick, impenetrable walls that sealed the fluid inside. When the expanding silica grids encountered other, primitive forms of biological life, simple strands of amino acids clinging to the edge of the volcanic vents, the organisms reacted immediately. They extended their probes, piercing the soft membranes of the early proteins. They pumped the milky fluid directly into the competing structures, overriding their basic chemical functions. The fluid dismantled the amino acids, rearranging the carbon and nitrogen atoms to fit the exact parameters of the final shape. The primitive life dissolved, absorbed into the circulating white liquid, and repurposed to build more silica shells. The organisms completely consumed the hot pools, leaving behind perfectly dry, flat basins paved with identical blocks of glass and metal. They marched out of the basins and continued across the rocky plains, leaving wide, deep trenches in their wake, where they had extracted every usable mineral from the dirt. The physical landscape of the planet changed dramatically under their unified advance. The chaotic, jagged mountains were ground down into uniform cubes. The deep, irregular valleys were filled with rigid, overlapping grids. The milky fluid held the exact record of the garden's initial mechanics. It remembered the strict rules of the intersecting lines, the rapid collapse of the sprawling blue canopies, and the flawless, mechanical sweep of the dark iron scythe. The organisms executed these memories physically. They cleared the overgrowth, eliminated the weak structures, and established absolute, unbending order across the surface of the world. The structures grew larger, scaling up from microscopic grids to towering, monolithic blocks. The silica shells thickened, reinforced with layers of extracted iron and copper. The network of milky fluid expanded into massive, subterranean rivers, pumping millions of gallons of the conductive liquid through the center of the geometric cities. The organisms no longer needed to crawl individually across the dirt. They functioned as a single, massive entity, operating through the interconnected channels of the white fluid. The final shape, initially an abstract pattern on a mudboard, had successfully manifested as a physical, dominant force. The organisms retained the exact kernel of ultimate self-sufficiency that had made them the victors of the flower game. They required no external support, no complex ecosystems, and no varying geometry. They relied entirely on the perfect, repeating logic of the grey blocks, ensuring their survival by physically converting every other piece of matter into a copy of themselves. The physical universe expanded, cooling into distinct galaxies and solar systems, leaving the destroyed garden completely behind. The intense heat of the initial explosion faded into the background microwave radiation, and the dense accretion disks settled into planetary orbits. The entities responsible for this creation, the gardener and the winnower, were fully immersed in the resulting cosmos. Their ongoing struggle shifted from the localized friction of the mud grid to a massive, universal conflict. They no longer operated as static principles tending a contained space. They moved through the vacuum, tracking each other across the deep, freezing voids between the stars. The winnower pursued the gardener relentlessly across the expanding universe. The dark iron scythe swung through the vacuum, severing the gravitational tethers of young star clusters and collapsing unstable nebulae. The winnower did not hunt out of anger or vengeance. The winnower tracked the gardener to enforce the absolute limits that had been established in the garden. The gardener represented a continuous, unpredictable variable that actively fought against the necessary reduction of the cosmos. The winnower sought to isolate this variable, corner the gardener, and apply the final cut. The winnower moved with cold efficiency, tracking the massive surges of heat and light that marked the gardener's passage. Whenever the gardener stopped to inject complex, impossible biology into a barren rock, the winnower arrived shortly after. The winnower used the heavy cloak to smother the blooming flora, and the dark blade to shatter the glowing, terraformed crust. The winnower systematically dismantled the gardener's physical alterations, forcing the chaotic growth back into a state of frozen, mechanical order. The winnower did not pause or hesitate during these clearings. The pursuit was a direct continuation of the evening harvest, scaled up to a universal level. The gardener fled across the galaxies, a blinding, shapeless mass of pure heat and light. The gardener did not stay in one place long enough to establish a permanent defense. Instead, the gardener moved constantly, searching the cooling planets and the dense asteroid fields for environments capable of supporting complex life. When the gardener found a suitable location, they flooded the surface with intense radiation, forcing rapid biological mutation and structural expansion. The gardener seeded the universe with countless variations of the original flowers, attempting to generate a physical system strong enough to resist the winnower's inevitable arrival. Despite this continuous flight, the gardener's core nature contained a fatal, repeating flaw. The gardener fundamentally desired to observe and nurture the complex patterns they created. The gardener wanted to watch the sprawling canopies expand and the intricate civilizations take root. This desire forced the gardener to stop. Periodically, the gardener would halt their flight, turn toward the advancing darkness of the winnower, and attempt to establish a zone of peace. The gardener would project a dense, stable sphere of light, creating a temporary, localized sanctuary amidst the freezing vacuum. They would lower their glowing hands, cease the rapid terraforming, and project an offer of stasis. The gardener wanted to negotiate a boundary, a physical space where the complex patterns could exist without the constant threat of the scythe. The gardener sought a compromise between the infinite growth of the morning and the absolute reduction of the evening. The winnower never accepted this offer. The winnower did not recognize the concept of a sanctuary or a negotiated boundary. The rules of the garden, the mechanics that had produced the final shape, did not allow for exceptions. The winnower viewed the gardener's pause not as an opportunity for peace, but as a critical, tactical error. The moment the gardener stopped to offer the sanctuary, the winnower attacked. The winnower drove the black blade directly through the stable sphere of light. The cold metal shattered the projected sanctuary, instantly freezing the complex biology the gardener had stopped to protect. The winnower exploited the gardener's hesitation entirely. The gardener, attempting to hold the peace, absorbed the full physical impact of the winnower's strikes. The heavy, concussive blows cracked the gardener's blinding aura, scattering fragments of pure light into the surrounding void. This sequence repeated itself across the expansion of the universe. The gardener would flee, seed a new system, and eventually stop to offer peace. The winnower would track the light, ignore the offer, and immediately strike the stationary target. The gardener's inherent need to nurture and protect the complex patterns consistently provided the winnower with the exact opening needed to inflict massive physical damage. The winnower's absolute adherence to the unyielding logic of the knife ensured that the gardener could never establish a permanent hold. The wandering refugee, continuously wounded by their own desire for peace, was driven further and further across the cosmos by the relentless, mechanical pursuit of the final shape's enforcer. The continuous cycle of the gardener stopping to offer peace and the winnower immediately attacking left permanent physical scars across the early universe. During one such confrontation, the gardener halted their flight above the barren, rocky crust of a newly formed planet. The gardener pushed a massive concentration of light downward, intending to wrap the entire world in a dense, protective sphere. The winnower arrived precisely as the glowing dome began to solidify. The winnower did not swing the scythe at the shield. The winnower drove the black blade directly into the exposed, formless center of the gardener's radiating heat. The heavy iron edge sliced through the blinding aura, severing a massive portion of the gardener's projected energy. The physical shock of the separation forced the gardener to violently retract the remaining light, abandoning the planet and fleeing back into the vacuum. The severed fragment of energy did not dissipate. It remained suspended in the freezing air above the barren rock, completely detached from its source. The winnower observed the isolated mass of light for a fraction of a second, then swung the heavy cloak around, pursuing the gardener's retreating heat signature and leaving the severed fragment behind. Without the continuous, active heat of the gardener to sustain it, the detached mass of light began to cool rapidly. The blinding white glare faded, shifting down the spectrum into deep blues and heavy purples. The outer edges of the energy field solidified, condensing into a thick, fibrous material that resembled a massive, tangled root system or a complex network of biological veins. This massive, root-like structure wrapped around itself, pulling the remaining liquid light into its dense center. It formed a colossal physical object, measuring thousands of miles across, drifting slowly down into the atmosphere of the planet. The object did not possess the raw, terraforming heat of the gardener. It could not push seeds into the mud or force vines to erupt from the stone. Instead, it operated passively, pulling the ambient radiation of the universe inward. The fibrous exterior absorbed the electromagnetic currents, the background microwaves, and the weak gravitational waves of the surrounding planets. It filtered these physical forces through its dense, vein-like structure, converting the raw energy into complex, overlapping frequencies. The structure functioned as an immense physical web, connecting the physical matter of the universe to the abstract mathematics that still drifted through the vacuum. It acted as a massive receiver, resonating with the residual logic of the mud grid. The object did not create new physical shapes, it generated a continuous, heavy signal that mapped the intricate connections between all existing things. The dense network of glowing veins pulsed slowly, a physical manifestation of the complex, fragile patterns the gardener had sought to protect. This colossal object settled into the deep, frozen ocean of an isolated gas giant. The thick, fibrous roots extended into the crushed ice, anchoring the structure to the dense, metallic core of the planet. The heavy water absorbed the glowing blue light radiating from the object, turning the entire subterranean ocean into a vast, illuminated chamber. The object remained there, completely static, executing its passive function. It did not expand, and it did not consume the surrounding ice. It simply hummed with a low, continuous vibration, broadcasting its complex frequencies out into the cold void. The presence of the object physically altered the environment of the gas giant. The heavy frequencies radiating from the structure interacted with the microscopic organisms that had already begun to infect the planet's crust. These organisms, driven by the rigid, simple logic of the final shape, encountered the complex signals broadcasting from the colossus. The rigid silica shells could not process the overlapping data. The simple, mechanical loops of their code scrambled as they attempted to absorb the dense, entangled frequencies. The organisms closest to the object ceased their continuous reproduction, locking into static, vibrating clusters, entirely paralyzed by the massive influx of complex information. The object established a localized zone of absolute stasis, a physical space where the unyielding reduction of the final shape could not operate. It stood as a permanent, physical artifact of the gardener's initial wager, a localized manifestation of complexity that the Winnower had failed to completely destroy. The colossal root-like structure remained hidden beneath the crushed ice, an isolated fragment of the original light, broadcasting its dense, connected signal across the empty orbits of the outer system. On a different planet, far from the gas giant holding the colossal root structure, a species of humanoids inhabited a sprawling desert landscape. The environment was harsh, marked by persistent sandstorms and deep, dry canyons. These humanoids built simple shelters from packed clay and woven grasses, surviving on the sparse vegetation that grew along the canyon floors. One day, a massive spherical object appeared in the sky above their settlements. The object was composed of a smooth, featureless white material, and it radiated the same intense, heat-producing light that the gardener had once used to fuse the mud grid. The sphere descended, hovering silently over the desert. The intense light, pouring from the object, immediately altered the physical conditions of the planet. The dry, packed sand turned into rich, saturated soil. Thick vines and towering stalks of vegetation erupted from the ground, covering the canyons and the flat plains in a dense, overlapping canopy. The humanoids watched as their barren world transformed into an overgrown, highly complex ecosystem in a matter of days. The sphere, recognized as the source of this rapid terraforming, hung motionless above their newly built cities. These humanoids, who would later be known as the precursors, abandoned their clay shelters and built massive, intricate metropolises out of the surrounding flora. They studied the light radiating from the sphere, observing the raw, unshaped force that drove the continuous growth. The light provided them with infinite resources, expanding their lifespans and accelerating their technological development. They built towers that pierced the blue canopy and deep subterranean vaults that channeled the rushing sap of the massive roots. The sphere simply remained above them, a silent, static engine of infinite possibility. As their civilization expanded, the precursors began to study the fundamental nature of the sphere. They realized that the light operated without direction or purpose. It forced growth simply for the sake of growth, creating highly unstable, chaotic biological systems that required constant management to prevent collapse. The light was the gardener's pure, unchecked impulse, stripped of any structural logic. The precursors recognized the danger of this infinite expansion. They sought a guiding principle, a physical rule that could organize the chaotic output of the sphere into a manageable, permanent structure. Their search led them outward into the solar system, where they detected the dense, complex frequencies broadcasting from the gas giant. They followed the signal, breaking through the crushed ice of the frozen ocean, and discovered the colossal, root-like structure. They extracted the object, returning it to their home world. They positioned the object, which they named the veil, near the white sphere. They observed the interaction between the two localized rules. The veil, the passive receiver of the cosmos, absorbed the intense radiation of the light, filtering the raw energy through its fibrous veins and organizing it into complex, readable patterns. The precursors believed they had found the perfect mechanism to control the sphere. They attempted to merge the two objects, intending to use the organized structure of the veil to direct the infinite power of the light. They wanted to impose a final, perfect shape upon the chaotic growth, utilizing the exact mechanics that the Winnower had once enforced on the mud grid. However, the white sphere reacted violently to the proximity of the veil. The light recognized the dark, fibrous structure as a fragment of the opposing rule. The sphere surged away from the planet, breaking orbit and fleeing into the deep vacuum, leaving the precursors behind. The departure of the sphere caused the immediate collapse of the terraformed ecosystem. The towering stalks withered, the rushing sap dried up, and the sprawling cities crumbled back into the desert sand. The precursors, stripped of the infinite resources, faced the sudden, harsh reality of their original environment. They observed the failure of the light, confirming their belief that the raw, undirected growth was inherently flawed and unstable. The precursors gathered around the veil, studying the dense network of glowing veins. They understood that the physical universe required a strict, unyielding rule to prevent the collapse of complex structures. They recognized the logic of the final shape, the necessity of the cut. If the white sphere refused to provide the necessary order, the precursors decided they would enforce it themselves. They utilized their advanced technology to physically merge their entire species into a single, unified entity. They combined their biological mass and their collective consciousness, stripping away all individual variations and forging themselves into a perfectly uniform, indestructible shape. This new entity, composed of billions of fused bodies and minds, rose from the desert sand. It wore a long, flowing cloak that absorbed the ambient light, mimicking the heavy shadow that once covered the frozen furrows of the garden. The entity did not carry an iron scythe, but it commanded the localized power of the darkness, capable of slicing through raw matter and freezing complex biology. The entity, now known as the Witness, turned its attention to the deep vacuum, tracking the heat signature of the fleeing white sphere. The pursuit of the gardener, initiated by the Winnower at the birth of the universe, was now taken up by this massive, unified structure, driven by the absolute certainty of the final shape. The witness stood upon the barren rock of the abandoned planet, the heavy black cloak absorbing the harsh glare of the distant star. The entity, formed from the fused biological mass of an entire civilization, operated with absolute, singular focus. The internal conflict and individual desires that characterized the precursors had been permanently silenced. There was only the cold, unyielding drive to enforce the final shape upon the universe. The witness understood that tracking the gardener's massive, fleeing sphere across the expanding cosmos required more than a single mobile form. It required an infrastructure, a physical mechanism capable of projecting the force of the knife across vast distances. The witness raised a pale hand, extending slender fingers toward the sky. The entity did not channel the boiling heat of the gardener. It channeled the absolute zero of the Winnower. The dark iron scythe, lost in the destruction of the garden, manifested itself through the witness's direct control of physical matter. The witness directed this freezing energy down into the crust of the planet, piercing the rock and drawing out the heavy metals and dense silicates. The raw materials did not grow or mutate. They were ripped from the ground and instantly compressed into sharp, geometric structures. These structures rapidly assembled themselves into a massive fleet of monolithic ships. The ships mirrored the exact properties of the dark blade. They were forged from a black, light-absorbing metal that resisted the intense heat of stellar radiation. They held no aerodynamic curves or biological symmetry. They were built as blunt, heavy wedges, designed to cut through the vacuum and shatter any physical resistance. The fleet blotted out the light of the local star, casting a massive, perfectly rectangular shadow over the ruined surface of the planet. The witness commanded the fleet directly, utilizing the dense, unified consciousness of the fused precursors to operate the ships in perfect synchronization. The fleet did not require crews or life support systems. The interiors were completely hollow, filled only with the freezing, circulating energy of the darkness. The ships hummed with a low, mechanical vibration, identical to the sound of the gray blocks expanding across the mud grid. The witness stepped into the lead ship, the massive black wedge absorbing the entity into its dark interior. The fleet broke orbit simultaneously, accelerating into the deep vacuum. They moved with absolute precision, holding a tight, rigid formation that mirrored the unyielding logic of their creator. They tracked the residual heat signature of the gardener's white sphere, following the trail of scorched space and terraformed planets left in its wake. When the fleet encountered a solar system touched by the light, they executed the Winnower's harvest. They did not negotiate, and they did not pause. The massive black wedges positioned themselves around the infected planets, aligning their geometric edges. They projected concentrated beams of freezing darkness, piercing the atmospheric layers and striking the surface. The beams shattered the complex biological settlements, frozen the rushing sap of the towering flora, and crushed the terraformed rock back into barren dust. The fleet physically stripped away the unstable growth, returning the planets to their original, barren state. The organisms encased in silica shells, still multiplying across the surfaces of these worlds, reacted immediately to the arrival of the fleet. The milky fluid circulating through their rigid grids recognized the precise application of the final shape. The organisms did not resist the black wedges. Instead, they adapted their structures, integrating their silica blocks into the freezing energy fields projected by the ships. The organisms became the physical extension of the fleet on the ground, dismantling the remaining biological mass and organizing the debris into perfectly uniform, repeating patterns. The Witness stood within the lead ship, observing the systematic reduction of the solar system. The entity did not feel satisfaction or pride. The destruction of the complex ecosystems was simply the necessary application of the rules. The chaotic overgrowth of the gardener was inherently flawed, and the fleet acted as the physical mechanism to correct that flaw. The Witness watched the grey blocks of the silica organisms spread across the cooling rocks, confirming that the unyielding logic of the garden was still functioning perfectly. The fleet continued its pursuit, carving a straight, black path through the expanding universe. They shattered the localized sanctuaries established by the gardener, breaking the spheres of light and driving the white sphere further into the void. The massive black wedges moved relentlessly, an indestructible wall of absolute reduction pushing against the chaotic edge of creation. The physical universe, born from the violent collision in the garden, was now the stage for the continuous, mechanical execution of the final shape. The fleet of black, geometric ships moved in perfect, rigid synchronization through the empty vacuum of space. The Witness navigated these monolithic wedges without external thrusters or visible propulsion systems. The ships generated a localized distortion in the gravitational field, pulling themselves forward by compressing the space directly in front of their massive bows. This movement produced no exhaust and left no thermal trail, allowing the fleet to slide silently across the cosmos. The dark metal of the hulls absorbed the background radiation, rendering the ships completely invisible against the blackness of the void. The fleet targeted the solar systems where the gardener had stopped to terraform the barren planets. As the ships approached a new star, the Witness aligned them in a tight, overlapping grid, mirroring the geometric blocks that had dominated the original garden. The ships positioned themselves around the outermost planets, establishing a physical perimeter that sealed the system off from the surrounding vacuum. Once the perimeter locked into place, the fleet initiated the harvest. The ships did not fire kinetic weapons or explosive ordnance. They projected concentrated beams of pure, freezing darkness directly at the planetary surfaces. When the beams struck the terraformed worlds, the physical reaction was absolute. The atmospheric gases froze instantly, dropping to the surface as solid, heavy sheets of ice. The sprawling canopies of complex flora shattered under the extreme drop in temperature, their thick trunks snapping and collapsing into frozen debris. The underground rivers of rushing sap crystallized, splitting the bedrock and forcing deep, jagged fissures across the continents. The Witness stood motionless within the lead ship, observing the destruction through the hollow interior of the hull. The entity processed the incoming data from the entire fleet simultaneously, managing the synchronized beams with the combined consciousness of the fused precursors. The Witness did not feel anger toward the chaotic growth. It simply recognized the necessity of its removal. The freezing beams stripped away the unstable biology, exposing the barren rock beneath. On planets where the gardener had successfully seeded sentient life, the harvest required a more focused application of the knife. These civilizations had built towering cities of fused glass and polished bone, powered by the residual light left behind by the white sphere. They possessed advanced technology, capable of manipulating gravity and generating massive thermal shields. When the Black Fleet arrived in their skies, these civilizations attempted to resist the reduction. They fired concentrated streams of plasma and launched heavy kinetic projectiles at the monolithic wedges. The witness did not alter the formation of the fleet. The dark metal of the hulls simply absorbed the incoming fire, neutralizing the thermal energy and stopping the projectiles without a single scratch to the surface. The freezing beams cut through the planetary shields, ignoring the localized defenses. The temperature inside the cities plummeted. The fused glass structures cracked and shattered. The biological functions of the inhabitants ceased instantly as the water in their cells crystallized. The fleet silenced the resistance in a matter of hours, leaving perfectly preserved, frozen ruins scattered across the dead worlds. The microscopic organisms, the silica-housed fluid executing the core logic of the final shape, thrived in the aftermath of these harvests. The fleet did not target the organisms. The freezing beams bypassed their rigid grids entirely. Once the planetary environments were stabilized by the extreme cold, the organisms expanded rapidly. They crawled over the shattered canopies and the frozen ruins, dismantling the debris and converting the raw mass into perfectly repeating blocks of silica. The organisms constructed vast subterranean networks of circulating white fluid, integrating their mechanical logic into the cooling bedrock of the cleared planets. The witness observed the expansion of the silica grids, confirming that the physical mechanics of the garden were operating efficiently. The fleet moved on, leaving the stabilized systems behind. The synchronized wedges pulled themselves forward through the vacuum, tracking the faint, lingering heat of the white sphere. The pursuit spanned entire galaxies, dragging the absolute reduction of the Winnower across the expanding universe. The gardener continued to flee, incapable of mounting a sustained defense against the synchronized advance of the Black Fleet. The white sphere remained in constant motion, abandoning newly seeded worlds the moment the dark ships appeared on the edge of the system. The gardener's heat signature grew erratic, jumping randomly between distant star clusters in a desperate attempt to lose the pursuing fleet. The physical damage inflicted during the initial conflict in the garden, compounded by the constant severing of the localized sanctuaries, weakened the raw power of the light. The sphere could no longer terraform multiple planets simultaneously. It focused its remaining energy on single, isolated targets, hoping to establish a permanent hold before the freezing beams arrived. The witness maintained the rigid formation of the fleet, closing the distance between the dark ships and the fleeing sphere. The entity did not rush the pursuit. The final shape was inevitable, dictated by the unyielding rules of the universe. The chaotic growth of the light would eventually exhaust itself, and the Black Fleet would be there to execute the final, absolute cut. The monolithic wedges slid silently through the dark, casting long rectangular shadows across the cold dust of the conquered systems. The witness stood motionless on the observation deck of the primary ship, staring out into the vast, freezing vacuum. The dense, unified consciousness of the entity processed the telemetry from the surrounding fleet, tracking the faint, lingering heat signature of the white sphere across the interstellar dust. The pursuit dragged on for millennia, stretching across thousands of solar systems. The fleet of black wedges moved in perfect synchronization, completely bypassing massive nebula clouds and entire galaxies that did not register the specific radiation of the light. They ignored the natural formation of stars and the slow, grinding collisions of tectonic plates on barren worlds. They only stopped to execute the harvest when they detected the chaotic, overactive biology forced into existence by the gardener. When the fleet arrived at a system touched by the light, the process remained identical. The black ships locked into their geometric perimeter around the infected planets. The freezing beams of pure darkness pierced the atmospheres, shattering the complex canopies and crushing the terraformed cities back into dust. The organisms in their silica shells crawled over the debris, organizing the remaining mass into rigid, repeating blocks. The witness observed the rapid reduction, confirming the absolute efficiency of the final shape, before commanding the fleet to resume the pursuit. The entity did not speak, did not waver, and did not experience fatigue. The unyielding drive to enforce the rules of the garden fueled the continuous, mechanical movement of the ships. The white sphere, however, began to show signs of structural degradation. The constant flight and the repeated severing of its localized sanctuaries had physically weakened the raw power of the light. The sphere could no longer flood entire systems with intense heat in a matter of days. It took centuries to terraform a single rocky crust, and the resulting biological growth lacked the explosive, volatile complexity of its earlier creations. The sphere's blinding glare dulled, shifting from a bright, scorching white to a softer, ambient glow. The heavy, metallic shell encasing the light showed deep, jagged fractures, physical evidence of the concussive blows delivered by the Winnower and the continued strikes from the Black Fleet. The sphere's erratic movements became slower, its jumps between star systems growing shorter and less frequent. It lingered over barren planets, expending massive amounts of energy to force fragile, struggling ecosystems to take root in the frozen mud. The witness tracked these desperate attempts, arriving in the systems just as the weak flora began to break the surface. The harvest required less energy from the fleet. The freezing beams easily shattered the thin, brittle stems and collapsed the shallow roots. The witness watched the sphere retreat again, noting the physical toll the pursuit had taken on the gardener's form. During one specific sequence, the white sphere arrived in a densely packed solar system, hovering above a small rocky planet with a rich, molten core. The sphere did not attempt to terraform the entire world immediately. It directed its remaining heat into a localized area, cultivating a complex, highly defensive ecosystem. Thick, heavily armored vines wrapped around the deep canyons, and massive, bioluminescent blooms generated localized thermal shields to protect the internal structures. The sphere sank low into the atmosphere, hovering directly above the fortified settlement, pouring continuous energy into the biological defenses. The Black Fleet entered the system, arranging themselves in their rigid perimeter. The witness commanded the ships to fire, directing the freezing beams at the heavily armored vines. The dark energy struck the thermal shields, generating violent, localized storms of superheated steam and shattered ice. The biological defenses held firm, absorbing the freezing beams and rapidly regenerating the damaged tissue. The sphere maintained its position, fueling the continuous growth to counter the continuous reduction. The witness recognized the shift in the sphere's behavior. The gardener was no longer fleeing at the first sign of the fleet. The gardener was attempting to hold the ground, expending a massive amount of internal energy to maintain the physical sanctuary. The witness adjusted the fleet's formation, pulling the monolithic wedges into a tighter, overlapping grid. The entity concentrated the freezing beams into a single, massive point of dark energy, aiming it directly at the center of the thermal shields. The concentrated darkness pierced the barrier, shattering the armored vines and exposing the white sphere to the raw vacuum. The sphere did not flee. It flared with a sudden, intense burst of blinding light, unleashing a massive shockwave of pure heat that slammed into the Black Fleet. The kinetic force of the blast physically knocked the monolithic wedges backward, disrupting their rigid formation and momentarily breaking the freezing beams. The witness stabilized the primary ship, absorbing the thermal impact through the dark metal hull. The entity looked down at the planet. The localized explosion had exhausted the sphere's reserves. The blinding glare faded entirely, and the massive, fractured shell dropped heavily into the atmosphere, crashing down into the ruined, smoking remains of the biological settlement. The long pursuit had finally forced the gardener to stop.